Murder at the Champagne Reception. A Hercule Poirot Mystery. Chapter 1. The Vineyard at Dusk. The chalk hills above the River Marne wore their autumn colour like an old woman wears jewels she no longer needs to justify, carelessly and with absolute confidence in their worth. Hercule Poirot, seated in the rear of a hired motorcar that negotiated the narrow lane with more enthusiasm than skill, regarded the rows of vines sweeping past the window and permitted himself a small sigh of satisfaction. He had been invited, after all, not to solve anything, but to drink good champagne and to be, for once, merely a guest. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, written in a hand so precise it might have been engraved rather than penned. My dear Poirot, it had begun, in the manner of a man unaccustomed to writing letters, and determined that this one, at least, should not betray him. You will recall that I once had the pleasure of assisting you, in a very small way, with a matter concerning a stolen necklace and a Belgian consul who ought to have known better. I ask now that you permit me to repay that pleasure 100-fold by attending the centenary of my house, Champagne d'Orival, this coming weekend at the Château d'Orival. There will be excellent wine, indifferent conversation, and, though I hesitate to burden an invitation with such a word, I confess I would value your presence for reasons I would rather explain in person. Henri d'Orival. Poirot had turned the letter over twice, as was his habit with any piece of correspondence that professed one purpose while radiating another. The reference to the necklace was accurate enough, a trifling affair, years ago, in which a minor official named d'Orival had provided him with a single, decisive fact about a consular seal. But a man does not write of reasons I would rather explain in person, unless those reasons trouble him considerably. Still, the wine had sounded excellent, and Poirot's curiosity, that great engine which had driven him across half of Europe, required only the smallest spark to turn over. The chateau itself announced its self-regard from a full kilometre away, a long avenue of plane trees, their leaves just beginning to bronze, opening at last onto a symmetrical facade of pale stone, its windows glinting gold with the last of the sun. Before it, a wide gravel forecourt already held a scattering of motor-cars, and liveried staff moved between them with the practised calm of people who had done this every year for a century and expected to do it for another. Poirot was met on the steps by a young footman who took his single suitcase with an expression suggesting he had expected a great deal more luggage from a guest of Poirot's evident distinction, and was privately disappointed. Poirot, who travelled light but immaculately, chose not to enlighten him. Monsieur d'Orival asked that you be shown to him directly upon arrival, monsieur, the footman said. Should you wish it before you rest? I wish it very much, said Poirot, and meant it. He was led not to a drawing-room, as he had expected, but through a side door and down a flight of worn stone steps into the cellars themselves, vast, cool, cathedral-like corridors, lined on either side with racks of bottles stretching away into a dimness lit only by widely spaced electric bulbs in iron cages. The air smelled of damp stone, of yeast, of something faintly sweetish that Poirot associated, not entirely happily, with fermentation left too long unwatched. Henri d'Orival was waiting at a small table set incongruously among the racks, a single lamp illuminating 2 glasses and a bottle already opened. He was a tall man, perhaps 70, with the upright bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime being deferred to and had grown so accustomed to it that he scarcely noticed any longer. But his hand, when he extended it, was not entirely steady, and his eyes, pale grey and shrewd, moved once, quickly, past Poirot's shoulder to the corridor behind, as though to be certain they were unobserved. Poirot, you came. I confess I was not entirely certain you would. An invitation to excellent champagne, monsieur, is not one I decline lightly. D'Orival's laugh was brief and did not reach his eyes. Sit, please. Try this, the cuvée du centenaire, which we unveil tomorrow evening at the reception. 100 years, Poirot, since my grandfather first pressed grapes on this hillside, and tomorrow the world will drink to it. He poured with a care that bordered on ritual. I wish to speak with you tonight, privately, before the house fills with people who will each want something from me, and none of them, I think, will want it honestly. Poirot sipped. The wine was indeed remarkable, dry, complex, with a long finish that spoke of grapes grown by people who had never hurried anything in their lives. You are troubled, monsieur. I am 71 years old, and I have built something that a certain number of people would very much prefer to inherit sooner rather than later. Dorval set down his glass. I do not say this to be dramatic. I say it because I have, in recent weeks, begun to feel watched, Poirot. Small things. A ledger moved from where I left it. A conversation that stopped precisely when I entered a room. I am revising my will this weekend, after the reception, and I have told certain people that I intend to. I would not be surprised if that announcement has already produced consequences I cannot see. You suspect someone specific? Dorval was silent for a long moment, turning his glass by its stem. I suspect everyone a little, and no one enough to say a name aloud. That is precisely why I wanted you here. Not as a detective, you understand, merely as a guest with unusually good eyes. Watch them for me, Poirot. Tell me, at the end of the weekend, what you have seen. And if I see nothing, monsieur, then I shall have enjoyed your company and wasted your time, and I will consider it a fair exchange. Dorval smiled, and this time something of warmth reached his eyes. Now, finish your glass. Tomorrow will be a long day, and I intend that tonight, at least, should not be. Poirot did not finish his glass so much as savour it, turning over in his mind, as he did so, the small catalogue of details a lesser man might have missed. Before we continue, a quick message for every mystery lover. If you're enjoying this story, you'll love the Baker Street Library, my collection of exclusive detective mystery ebooks available only in ebook format. Download instantly and enjoy your next investigation anytime. You'll find the link in the description, the pinned comment, and the channel description. Now, let's get back to the mystery. The slight tremor in Dorval's hand, that was not, he thought, the tremor of age alone. The quickness of that single glance down the corridor, the fact that a man who spoke of being watched had chosen, of all places, the cellars, dim, half-hidden, and reached by a door most guests would never think to use, in which to say so. You will think me an old fool, perhaps, Dorval added, as Poirot rose to be shown to his room, for summoning a detective of your reputation merely to watch dinner guests for a weekend, as though you were a governess, set to mind unruly children, rather than a man who has confounded murderers across half the capitals of Europe. I have been asked, monsieur, to do a great many stranger things in my career, and for considerably less honest reasons than a father's concern for his own household. I do not think you a fool. I think you a man who has built something of value, and who understands, better than most, how rarely value is left undisturbed by those who stand to gain from its disturbance. Dorval smiled at that, a real smile this time, and for a moment the tiredness lifted from his face entirely. You understand me better after one glass of wine, Poirot, than my own children have managed in 40 years. Perhaps that is the tragedy of building something too large to carry gracefully. One forgets, in the building of it, to teach the ones who will inherit it how to want it for the right reasons. He said nothing more of substance that evening, turning the conversation instead to the history of the estate, the particular chalk soil of the hillside, the grandfather who had first pressed grapes there with more ambition than capital. And Poirot, listening, found himself charmed despite his private unease, for a man's love of a thing he has built well is rarely without its own quiet dignity, whatever darker currents may run beneath it. It was gone 11 when Dorval finally rose, refilled Poirot's glass one last time. For the walk back to your room, my friend, the cellars are cold at night, and pressed his hand with a warmth that Poirot would remember, in the days that followed, rather more often than he might have wished to. He did not yet know that he would recall this conversation many times before the weekend was out, nor that the hand which had poured his wine with such loving precision would, within 24 hours, pour no wine again. Chapter 2. A Toast Refused. By the following afternoon, the Château d'Orival had filled with the particular species of noise that accompanies a great many well-dressed people, determined to enjoy themselves, whether or not enjoyment came naturally. Motor cars continued to arrive throughout the morning. By 3 o'clock, the forecourt held enough of them to stock a small showroom, and the ballroom, thrown open for the occasion, its long windows giving onto a terrace, and beyond it, the vines themselves, already gilded with the low autumn sun, rang with laughter that struck Poirot's ear as being pitched, in several cases, a half-tone too high. He had spent the morning, ostensibly idle, in fact extremely busy, cultivating the habit, invaluable to a man in his position, of being underestimated. A small, foreign, elderly gentleman with an enormous moustache and a fussy manner about the crease of his trousers invited very little suspicion and, as a consequence, was told a very great deal. From the housekeeper, Madame Brassard, he learned that the family had gathered in full for the first time in over a year, and that this alone had produced a great deal of atmosphere, monsieur, if you understand my meaning. From a wine steward polishing glasses with the solemnity of a priest preparing a chalice, he learned that Monsieur d'Orival had personally selected and sealed 6 magnums of the new cuvée for the reception, and that one of these, the largest, ribboned in gold, was reserved exclusively for the master's own toast, to be opened by no hand but that of Louis Carnot, the chef de cave, who had served the house for 30 years and permitted no one else to touch a bottle destined for Monsieur's own glass. By the time the guests began to assemble on the terrace for the toast itself, Poirot had assembled, in the neat compartments of his mind, a preliminary catalogue of the household. There was Etienne d'Orival, the elder son, a broad, restless man of 40, who managed the vineyards and made no secret of his conviction that he alone understood them, nor of his resentment that his father continued, after 30 years, to overrule him on matters of blending and price. There was Camille, the daughter, quieter, watchful, married to a vintner named Aristide Roux, whose own small estate 2 valleys distant was, by every account Poirot had gathered, teetering toward ruin. There was Sylvie d'Orival, the second wife, 30 years her husband's junior, exquisitely dressed and exquisitely composed, whom the servants discussed in lowered voices and careful phrases. There was Odile Vasseur, Henri's secretary of 15 years, grey-haired and precise, who managed the household accounts with an authority that servants obeyed more readily than they obeyed the family. There was Marcus Ryer, an American of considerable wealth who had, it was widely whispered, offered a very great deal of money for the d'Orival estate and been refused, and who had, none the less, been invited to the centenary with a graciousness Poirot found faintly curious. And there was Julien Fabre, a young journalist of intense manner and unfashionable shoes, whose presence no one seemed quite able to explain, and who spent a good deal of his time near the cellar door with the studied casualness of a man pretending not to be interested in something. Beyond this inner circle moved the wider ring of guests who had come for the centenary as one comes to any great occasion of a neighbour's making. The mayor of the nearest town, resplendent in his sash, and visibly gratified to be seated near the family. A bishop of moderate seniority, who blessed the day's proceedings with the practised warmth of a man who had blessed a great many similar proceedings, and expected the wine, at least, to reward the effort. Several rival vintners from neighbouring estates, exchanging courtesies with the particular care reserved for competitors one has no wish to offend, and a scattering of d'Orival cousins, aunts and old family friends, whose presence, unremarkable in itself, provided precisely the crowd and noise beneath which a single quiet act might pass entirely unnoticed. Poirot catalogued them without dwelling upon them long, for instinct, sharpened by long practice, told him already that whatever answer awaited him in this affair would be found not among the 60 or 70 strangers filling the terrace with polite chatter, but among the smaller and more dangerous circle bound to Henri d'Orival, by blood, by service, or by ambition thwarted. Henri d'Orival appeared on the terrace at 5:30 precisely, in the dark suit he reserved, Madame Brassard had confided, for occasions he considered serious rather than merely festive, which struck Poirot, given the nature of the day, as an odd distinction to draw. Louis Carnot followed a pace behind, bearing the great gold-ribboned magnum with both hands, as a verger might bear a relic. The toast itself was brief. D'Orival spoke of his grandfather, of chalk and patience, of 100 years of a family's stubbornness against a hillside that did not care to be stubborn with. He raised his glass, poured for him alone from the ceremonial magnum, the golden wine catching the last light, and the assembled company raised theirs in turn, murmuring the toast back to him with the particular warmth people reserve for moments they suspect they will be asked, later, whether they enjoyed. Poirot, standing a little apart near the terrace balustrade, watched not the glass but the faces around it. He saw Etienne's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He saw Sylvie's hand holding her own glass, entirely steady, and her eyes fixed not on her husband but on Marcus Ryer across the terrace. He saw Camille look away entirely, toward the vines, as though she could not bear to watch the toast at all. He saw Odile Vasseur's lips move very slightly, not in the toast but, Poirot thought, in something closer to a private prayer. Henri d'Orival drank. For a moment nothing happened, and Poirot allowed himself to believe that nothing would. Then the glass slipped from d'Orival's fingers, shattering on the terrace stone with a sound absurdly small for what it announced, and the man himself, his face suddenly the colour of old parchment, put one hand to his chest and folded, quite slowly, quite silently, to the ground, as though even in dying he could not quite bring himself to make a scene at his own centenary. Chapter 3. The centenaire falls silent. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a death in a crowded room, not the silence of absence, but of a great many people simultaneously deciding not to believe what they have just seen. It lasted, on the terrace of the Château d'Orival, perhaps 3 full seconds before it broke into screaming, and into the scraping of chairs, and into Sylvie d'Orival's voice rising above the rest in a single sustained cry of her husband's name. Poirot reached the fallen man within moments, kneeling beside him with a speed that surprised those guests composed enough to notice it. He required only a glance to confirm what his instinct had already told him on the chateau steps the night before. Henri d'Orival was beyond any aid Poirot or anyone else on that terrace could offer. The pupils, the pallor, the faint bitter almond note beneath the wine on the dying breath. Poirot catalogued each with the detachment of long practice, even as some part of him, the part that had drunk this man's wine and heard his fears not 18 hours before, felt the loss as something more than professional. "No one," he said, rising, and his voice carried with an authority that silenced even Sylvie's weeping, "is to touch the glass. No one is to touch the bottle." Madame Brassard, the housekeeper, had appeared, white-faced, at the terrace door. "You will telephone at once for the police and for a doctor, though I fear the doctor will arrive only to confirm what we already know." It was Etienne who found his voice first, stepping forward with the belligerence of a man using anger to hold panic at bay. "Who are you to give orders in my father's house?" "I am a guest, monsieur, as you are aware, invited by your father himself. I would add only that I have some small experience of sudden death, and that in the next quarter of an hour, before shock gives way to grief, and grief scatters everyone's recollection beyond recovery, it would serve your father's memory considerably better to preserve this terrace exactly as it stands than to argue about my credentials. Something in the flat certainty of this reached even Etienne, and he stepped back. The magnum still stood upon its stand near the terrace balustrade, 3/4 full, its gold ribbon undisturbed. Poirot studied it without touching it, the cork lying beside it on a small silver tray, the wax seal broken cleanly, the bottle itself showing no sign of having been opened by any hand but the one that had, by every account, opened it that afternoon before an audience of 30 people. And there lay the difficulty that would occupy Poirot for the better part of the evening that followed, as the local commissaire, a stout and not unintelligent man named Berthold, arrived with a doctor and a small retinue of gendarmes, and the guests were herded, protesting in various registers of outrage and grief, into the great salon to await questioning. For Henri d'Orival had drunk from a glass poured, before 30 witnesses, from a bottle opened, before those same 30 witnesses, by Louis Carnot alone, and no one else at that toast, drinking from the very same bottle moments before and after, had suffered so much as a moment's discomfort. "You understand my difficulty, Monsieur Poirot," said Berthold, some 2 hours later, in the small study d'Orival had used for estate business, and which now served, with a certain grim appropriateness, as the seat of the investigation. The doctor's preliminary opinion, poison, almost certainly of the cardiac glycoside family, foxglove or its close relations, administered in a dose sufficient to stop a strong man's heart within minutes, lay written on a card between them. The bottle is innocent, the other guests who drank from it live, and yet d'Orival alone is dead, and dead within moments of the single glass poured for him and for no one else. "You put the matter with admirable precision, Monsieur le Commissaire," said Poirot. "The poison, then, was not in the bottle, it was in the glass, or introduced into the wine after it was poured, and before Monsieur d'Orival raised it to his lips. A window of perhaps 90 seconds, during a toast at which every eye in the household, by strange design or stranger coincidence, happened to be fixed upon Monsieur d'Orival and not upon his glass. Which narrows our suspects to precisely no one, since everyone was watching him, and no one, it seems, was watching the glass at all. On the contrary, mon ami," Poirot folded his small hands upon the desk before him, and his green eyes, ordinarily mild with a kind of amused patience, had taken on the particular brightness that those who knew him well had learned to associate with the awakening of his little grey cells. "It narrows them a great deal, for someone in that gathering was watching the glass most carefully indeed, closely enough to ensure that a substance introduced into it would find its way, undiluted and unremarked, into a dying man's heart. We have only to discover which of our 30 guests possessed both the opportunity to approach that glass unobserved and a reason compelling enough to have studied, in advance, precisely how such a thing might be done." He rose, smoothing his waistcoat with the small, precise gesture that was, in Poirot, something very like the drawing of a blade. "I think, Monsieur le Commissaire, that we had better begin with the family." Chapter 4. A detective among the guests. The great salon, by 10 o'clock that night, had taken on the peculiar atmosphere of a room in which grief and self-interest were being very carefully rationed out in equal measure. Sylvie d'Orival sat apart by the cold hearth, a black shawl drawn about her shoulders though the evening was mild, dabbing at eyes that Poirot noted remained, upon close observation, remarkably dry between dabbings. Etienne paced. Camille sat perfectly still beside her husband, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles had whitened, while Aristide Roux murmured to her, in a low voice, that seemed to bring her no comfort whatever. Odile Vasseur had taken up a position near the door, as though unable to decide whether she belonged among the family or among the staff, and stood there now with the isolation of someone who belonged, in her own estimation, to neither. Marcus Ryer had procured a brandy from somewhere and drank it with the composure of a man who had attended a great many difficult dinners in his life, and found this, on the whole, merely another of them. Julien Fabre alone seemed to Poirot genuinely and simply afraid, his young face pale, his eyes moving continually toward the terrace doors, as though he expected the dead man to walk back through them. Commissaire Berthold had granted Poirot, with the ease of a man glad to share responsibility for an unpleasant task, the first round of private interviews, and it was in the small study that Poirot received them, one by one, over the course of that long evening. Etienne came first, and came angry, which Poirot had expected and, in its way, welcomed, anger being so much more informative than composure. "My father was 71, he said, dropping into the chair opposite Poirot's without invitation. "He might have died of his heart at any moment these last 5 years. That you are all so determined to make a murder of it. The doctor is quite certain, monsieur, that no natural failing of the heart produces symptoms of that particular character, nor acts with that particular speed. I am sorry to tell you that the matter is not in doubt." Etienne's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke again, more quietly. "Then someone in this house is a murderer, and I do not care to guess which of my own family it might be. You manage the vineyards, I am told, and have done so for some years. For 15 years, and been overruled on every decision of consequence for 15 years, if that is what you are circling toward. Yes, my father and I disagreed. We disagreed about the blend of the centenaire itself. I wished for something bolder, more suited to the American palate that Ryer represents so generously, and my father wished, as he always wished, to make the wine his grandfather would have recognized. We disagreed as a father and son who both love the same thing disagree. It does not follow that I poisoned his champagne." "You knew, then, that he intended to revise his will this weekend?" A flicker, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. He had said as much. He said it to all of us, at dinner, 3 nights before we came here. He seemed to consider it a kind of test, watching each of our faces as he said it. I confess I did not enjoy the sensation of being tested in my own father's house. "And what conclusion did you draw, monsieur, as to the direction his revision might take?" "I concluded," said Etienne, standing rather more abruptly than the question warranted, "that my father enjoyed his power a great deal more than he enjoyed exercising it wisely, and that is the only conclusion I am prepared to offer you tonight." Camille, when her turn came, offered a great deal less, and in offering it, told Poirot rather more than she perhaps intended. She spoke in a low, careful voice of her husband's estate, of 2 poor harvests in succession, of a debt that had begun, in the last year, to keep her awake at night, though she insisted, when Poirot asked directly, that she had never discussed these difficulties with her father, because he would have made of it another lesson, and I did not think I could bear another lesson just now. "Your father intended to revise his will," Poirot said gently. "Did you hope, madame, that the revision might favour you?" Her eyes, when they met his, held something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but occupied some unhappy country between the two. "I hoped," she said, very quietly, "that he would notice I existed. That is all I permitted myself to hope, Monsieur Poirot. I had learned better, over 40 years, than to hope for anything more particular than that." She said nothing further, and Poirot, who had learned in a long career precisely when a silence was more eloquent than any answer, did not press her. Chapter 5. The Little Grey Cells Awaken. Sylvie Doreval entered the study with the composure of a woman who had rehearsed, Poirot suspected, not her answers so much as her bearing, the precise angle of the chin that suggested grief without abandoning dignity, the shawl drawn just so. "You will wish to know, Monsieur Poirot, whether I married Henri for his money," she said, before he had asked her anything at all. Everyone in that salon believes it, and I have grown tired of waiting for the question to be put less bluntly than I have just put it myself. You anticipate me most efficiently, madame. Did you? I married him because he was the first man in my life who asked what I thought before he told me what to think. Whether that constitutes love in the sense your generation understood it, I could not say. It was enough for me. Her composure slipped, briefly, into something that looked for the first time like genuine feeling. We had 11 years, monsieur. I do not expect you to believe they were happy ones merely because I say so, but I had no need of his death. My position under the marriage contract was already secure, considerably more secure, I might add, than it would have been under whatever revision he intended this weekend. You knew, then, the substance of the revision he planned. A pause, precisely calculated. I knew that he had grown troubled these last months about Etienne's ambitions for the estate, and about Camille's silence, which he had begun, very late I think, and with some shame, to recognize as a kind of accusation. I did not know precisely what he intended to change. I knew only that whatever it was, it would very likely cost me nothing, and might well have cost his children a great deal, which is not, Monsieur Poirot, in case you are constructing a motive from it, a reason for me to have wished him alive 1 hour longer than he was. It was Odile Vasseur, interviewed last among the family's inner circle, who gave Poirot the detail that turned, at last, the key in a lock he had felt working loose all evening. She spoke of 15 years' service with a dry precision that nonetheless trembled once or twice at its edges. "You knew Monsieur Dorival very well, madame," Poirot observed. "Better, I think, than anyone at that toast." "I knew his ledgers better than any confessor knows a soul, monsieur, and I dare say I knew the man himself nearly as well." She hesitated. "There is a thing I have not told the commissaire, because I could not see how it mattered, and I am no longer certain that it does not. Tell me, madame, and permit me to be the judge of that. 3 weeks ago, Monsieur Dorival asked me to locate, from the estate library, an old book on the toxicology of plants, a text his own grandfather had owned, concerning substances found naturally in the hedgerows and gardens of the region. He did not say why he wanted it. I assumed at the time some idle curiosity, or perhaps a concern about the vines themselves, since foxglove grows wild along the lower terraces, and cattle have sickened on it before now. I found the book for him. I did not think of it again until this evening, when the doctor spoke the word foxglove aloud in this very room. Poirot sat very still. "Where is this book now, madame?" I could not say. I gave it to him in his study, and I have not seen it since. When, 20 minutes later, Poirot searched that same study with Berthold's grudging permission, the book was nowhere to be found upon its shelves, but in the grate, among the ashes of a fire lit, by Madame Brassard's account, only that very afternoon, Poirot's questing fingers drew out a single half-burned page, its edge crisped black, bearing still, faintly legible, a woodcut illustration of a foxglove's spotted throat, and beneath it, in the small cramped type of an old edition, a fragment of text describing the plant's action upon the human heart. "So," said Poirot softly, turning the fragment in the lamplight, "someone in this house did not merely suspect how Henri Dorival might be killed. Someone studied it, and someone, this very afternoon, between the moment of his death and the moment the gendarmes arrived, thought it wise to burn the evidence of that study before any of us thought to look for it." He looked up at Berthold, and there was, in his green eyes, nothing now of the amiable elderly guest who had arrived the evening before to drink good champagne. "I think, Monsieur le Commissaire, that our murderer has just told us, without meaning to, that they were in this house, and very possibly in this room, after the household had already begun to gather for questioning, which means our murderer is still here among us, and grows, I think, considerably more frightened with each hour that passes." Chapter 6. voices behind closed doors. Poirot passed a restless night, which was, in itself, sufficiently unusual to merit his own private notation. He was not a man given to insomnia. He considered it, on principle, an inefficient use of a body's resources. But the half-burned page lay in his mind as it lay, carefully preserved between two sheets of blotting paper, in the drawer of his room's writing desk, and he found himself turning it over as he might turn over a suspect's alibi, searching for the seam where the fabric did not quite match. He rose before 6 and walked, as was his habit in the country, along the terrace where Henri d'Orival had died less than 12 hours before. The stone had been scrubbed clean by some conscientious and doubtless traumatized member of the household staff, and only a faint, irregular discoloration near the balustrade suggested that anything at all had occurred there. Poirot stood for some minutes regarding the spot, and then, on impulse, descended the terrace steps to the lower garden, where, Odile Vasseur had mentioned it almost in passing, foxglove grew wild along the untended margin between lawn and vine. He found it easily enough, tall spires of spotted bells, purple and cream, growing in a loose stand beside a low stone wall not 30 paces from the kitchen door. And he found, too, something rather more interesting, a section of the stand, perhaps a dozen plants, cut back cleanly at the stem, the fresh wounds still faintly weeping sap, in sharp contrast to the untouched growth around them. "Someone has been gathering flowers, it would seem," said a voice behind him, though I confess I would not have chosen foxglove for a centenary bouquet. Poirot turned to find Marcus Ryer approaching along the garden path, dressed for walking, an unlit cigar between 2 fingers. The American had the easy, watchful manner of a man who made a great deal of money, by appearing more relaxed than his circumstances warranted. "You are an early riser, Monsieur Ryer." "Habit of the trade. I never made a good deal past 9 in the morning in my life. By then, everyone else has had time to think better of it." Ryer's gaze went to the cut stems, and something in his expression sharpened, though his voice remained easy. "That's an ugly coincidence, given the doctor's diagnosis last night." "I do not, as a rule, place a great deal of faith in coincidence, monsieur. You made an offer, I am told, for this estate." "I made 3 offers, over as many years, each more generous than the last, and Henri d'Orival turned down every one of them with the same courteous, immovable smile. I won't pretend I came here this weekend without hoping the centenary might soften him. I will tell you plainly I did not come here hoping to kill him for it. A dead man signs no contracts, Monsieur Poirot, and I've a great deal more use for a live seller than a dead one. Unless, monsieur, the estate might now be acquired more cheaply, or more easily, from an heir less attached to it than the father was." Rayer's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes grew very still. "You're a careful man. I respect that. I'll tell you something I hadn't planned to volunteer. I spoke with Etienne d'Orival 2 nights ago, at some length, about precisely that possibility, what terms he might consider, were he ever in a position to consider them. I'd call it prudent business rather than murder, but I imagine you've heard worse justifications offered in better faith." He walked on, leaving Poirot alone with the cut stems and a great deal to consider. It was Julien Fabre, encountered an hour later hovering with poorly disguised anxiety near the cellar door, the same position, Poirot recalled, he had occupied on the previous afternoon, who supplied the next thread. Pressed gently, the young journalist's composure cracked with almost pathetic speed. "I am not here as a guest, monsieur. Not truly," he admitted, his voice low. "I write for a Paris paper, and I had understood, from a source I am not at liberty to name, that d'Orival money during the last war was not so clean as 3 generations of centenary toasts would have the public believe. I came hoping for an interview. d'Orival refused to see me privately, but he did not send me away, which I took, perhaps foolishly, as a kind of invitation to wait. "And did you learn anything, monsieur, in your waiting?" Fabre hesitated, glancing again toward the cellar door. "I learned that Louis Carnot, the chef de cave, does not like to be watched near the ceremonial bottles. I learned it because he told me so himself, 3 days ago, in terms rather more forceful than the occasion seemed to warrant." Poirot's small eyes narrowed with interest. "Indeed, monsieur, indeed." "There is one thing more," Fabre added, lowering his voice further still, though no one else stood within earshot on the garden path. "I saw Mademoiselle Vasseur in the cellar corridor 2 nights ago, quite late, carrying a small case of the kind a woman might use for correspondence rather than for wine. I thought nothing of it at the time. A secretary about her employer's business, I assumed, and no concern of mine. I mention it now only because you have asked me to withhold nothing, however small, and because a journalist's habit, once formed, is never entirely to trust the innocence of anything witnessed after midnight." "You did well to mention it, monsieur," said Poirot, and filed the detail away, as was his custom, in the small and orderly compartment of his mind, reserved for facts whose significance had not yet declared itself, but which experience had taught him rarely remained silent for very long. Chapter 7. The Cellar Master's Hands. Louis Carnot received Poirot in the cellars themselves, among the racks of aging wine, as though unwilling, or unable, to discuss his craft anywhere it was not physically present around him. He was a broad-weathered man of perhaps 60, with the permanently stained fingers of 30 years spent among corks and lees, and hands that Poirot noted even now trembled very slightly as they rested upon a rack of bottles, though the cellar was cool rather than cold. "You have opened every ceremonial bottle this house has produced for 30 years, monsieur," Poirot began, without preamble. "It was you, and you alone, who opened the magnum from which Henri d'Orival drank his last glass of wine. I have opened 1,000 bottles in this cellar, monsieur, and poisoned not one of them." Carnot's voice was low, rough, and entirely without the deference the other staff had shown Poirot throughout the investigation. "You may ask the commissaire's men to search every corner of my cellar, my cottage, my person. You will find nothing, because there is nothing to find. I do not doubt your skill in opening a bottle cleanly, monsieur. I wonder only whether you might tell me something of your history with this house. 30 years is a long service, and long service is not always a happy one." Something moved behind Carnot's eyes, old, banked, and very deep. "My father worked these same cellars before me, monsieur. He died in them, in 1908, when a stack of racked bottles collapsed upon him during a hard frost that Henri d'Orival's own father, old Gustave, had been warned might crack the cellar walls if the heating were not properly maintained that winter. Gustave d'Orival chose to save the expense. My father chose to die for it, over 3 days, in the room above the one you are standing in now." Poirot said nothing, allowing the silence to draw the rest from him. Henry was a boy of 12 when it happened. He grew into a fair enough master, as masters go, fairer than his father certainly. He gave me my position when I was 20, and I have served this house honestly for 30 years since, because a man must eat, and because bitterness, however justified, does not put bread on a table. Carnot's jaw tightened. "But do not ask me to pretend I loved Henri d'Orival as a son loves a father, monsieur. When the house of d'Orival buried my own father in a cellar, it refused to repair. You knew Monsieur d'Orival intended to revise his will. Everyone in this house knew it. He announced it like a king granting an audience, watching us all for our reactions, as Etienne will have told you, since I understand he was not shy in his own account of the matter. Did you hope, monsieur, that the revision might touch you, after 30 years of loyal service?" Carnot's laugh was short and entirely without humour. "I hoped for nothing from that will, Monsieur Poirot, because I had asked for nothing in 30 years, and did not intend to begin asking now, in my 60th year, like a beggar at the gate. What I hoped, if you must have the truth of it, was that Henri would finally agree to the sale Monsieur Rea proposed. New money, new ownership, and perhaps at last a cellar properly maintained, and a chef de cave permitted to run it as it ought to be run, rather than as an old man's sentiment demanded. He turned back to his racks. The conversation, in his own estimation, plainly concluded. I did not kill Henri d'Orival for revenge 30 years delayed, monsieur. I had rather more current reasons to wish him alive and persuadable than dead and mourned. Poirot left the cellars troubled by a sensation he had learned, over a long career, never to dismiss. The sensation of having been told the truth, quite deliberately, in order that a larger falsehood might pass unnoticed beneath it. Carnot's grievance was old, genuine, and, Poirot suspected, offered up precisely because it was old and genuine, a decoy laid across a trail that led somewhere else entirely. He climbed the cellar stairs slowly, turning over in his mind the image of Carnot's trembling hands, and found himself thinking not of 30 years past, but of the previous afternoon, of a man who alone had held that ceremonial bottle, who alone had stood close enough to the glass, in the 90 seconds between pouring and drinking, to have done what needed to be done without a single one of 30 witnesses remarking it, because every one of those 30 witnesses had been watching, as intended, the master of the house and not his servant. Chapter 8. A Widow's Arithmetic. It was Hastings, for Poirot's old friend and companion had arrived that morning, summoned by a telegram sent the previous evening, and had settled himself with evident pleasure into the role of sounding board, who first gave voice to the difficulty that had been troubling Poirot since his conversation in the cellars. "It seems to me," said Hastings, over a late breakfast taken in a small parlour, away from the general gloom of the household, "that you've collected motives enough to hang the whole family twice over, and not one shred of proof against any single one of them. Etienne wanted control of the vineyards. Camille wanted money, or love, or both. The wife had no motive you can find, which in your business, old man, usually means she's hiding the best one. Rhea wanted the estate, and had been talking terms with the son. The journalist wanted a scandal. And now this cellar fellow with 30 years of grievance and shaking hands, it's practically an embarrassment of riches. You put your finger, mon ami, with your usual directness, upon precisely the difficulty. We have motives scattered about this house like confetti at a wedding. What we lack is opportunity narrowed to a single hand, and that, I think, is where we must now direct our little grey cells, rather than continuing to marvel at how thoroughly everyone in this household appears to have detested, in their own particular fashion, a man they all professed, not 24 hours ago, to be celebrating. He rose and paced the small parlour, his hands clasped behind his back. Consider the physical facts, Hastings, stripped of all the emotion that surrounds them. The poison was not in the bottle. The doctor's tests, which arrived this morning, confirm it absolutely. The wine remaining in the magnum is entirely innocent, and the 6 other guests who drank from it before the toast was concluded suffered nothing whatever. The poison, therefore, was introduced directly into Henri d'Orival's own glass. In the interval, some 90 seconds by the accounts of several witnesses, between the pouring of that glass and the moment he raised it to drink. Which means someone stood close enough to his glass during those 90 seconds to do it unseen. Precisely. And who, Hastings, stood closest to Henri d'Orival during a toast, holding, by long custom and by the arrangement of the terrace itself, a position at his very elbow? Hastings frowned. Carnot, surely, he'd have poured the glass and remained near enough while the toast was given. Carnot poured the glass, yes, and stepped back, as I am assured by no fewer than 4 independent witnesses, to a position some 3 paces distant, from which he watched the toast, as was proper for a servant of his position, with the rest of the household. It is a curious feature of formal occasions, Hastings, that we permit certain people to stand very close to us at certain moments, and expect them to withdraw immediately after, and no one thinks twice about the withdrawal, because it is precisely what custom demands. I wonder very much who else approached Monsieur d'Orival, however briefly, in that narrow window, perhaps to offer a private word of congratulation, or a small adjustment to his collar, or some other trivial pretext that no witness would think worth mentioning, because it appeared so entirely unremarkable at the time. It was this line of inquiry that led Poirot, an hour later, to Madame Brassard, who had stood nearer the terrace doors than any other member of the household, and who possessed, moreover, the housekeeper's invaluable habit of noticing precisely who went where. "There was a moment, monsieur, now that you press me to recall it in detail," she said slowly, "when Madame Camille approached the master, just after the bottle was poured and before the toast itself began. She said something to him, I could not hear what, and touched his sleeve. It seemed the most natural thing in the world at the time, monsieur. A daughter, wishing her father well before he spoke. And did anyone else approach him, madame, in that same interval?" Madame Brassard considered, her brow furrowed with the effort of honest recollection rather than convenient invention. "Madame Sylvie stood beside him throughout, monsieur, as a wife naturally would, and Mademoiselle Vasseur came forward with a small card, some note of the day's arrangements, I believe, which she handed to him and then withdrew." Poirot's eyes had taken on their brightest, most dangerous gleam. 3 women, then, each with occasion to stand at Henri d'Orival's elbow in the very moment his death was prepared, and each with a reason that appeared, to every witness present, entirely too ordinary to remark upon. He turned to Hastings with the particular energy of a man who has, at last, felt the shape of the truth beginning to emerge from the fog surrounding it. "I think, mon ami, that it is time we examined rather more closely what each of these ladies is capable of hiding beneath the appearance of the entirely ordinary." Hastings, ever practical, poured himself a second cup of coffee and regarded his old friend with the particular expression of a man who has learned, over many years of partnership, that Poirot's most dangerous conclusions are invariably reached at moments of apparent idleness rather than visible exertion. "You make it sound almost simple, put that way. 3 women, 90 seconds, 1 glass. And yet you've spent 2 days collecting motives from half the household as though you meant to use all of them at once. A detective who collects motives without first testing them against the plain mechanics of the crime, Hastings, is a detective who will end by accusing the whole of France and convicting no one. I have found it far more productive, in a long career, to reverse the customary order, to establish first who could physically have done the thing, and only then to ask which of that narrower number had sufficient reason to do it. We have narrowed our suspects this very morning from 30 witnesses to 3 women and 1 manservant who stood, in that fatal 90 seconds, close enough to matter. It remains only to discover which among that 4 possessed also the particular and rather specialized knowledge that turns an ordinary garden flower into an instrument of murder. And you believe Madame Brassard's account entirely reliable? I believe, mon ami, that a woman who has kept house for a great family for 20 years notices a great deal more than she is ever asked about, and forgets very little of what she notices, provided one has the patience to ask her the right questions in the right order. It is a resource, Hastings, that Scotland Yard undervalues shamefully, and that I have never once regretted consulting first. Chapter 9. The Journalist's Ledger. Julien Fabre's room, when Poirot requested, and Berthold, with only token reluctance, granted, permission to examine it, proved a good deal more revealing than its occupant's nervous manner had suggested it might. Beneath a false bottom in an otherwise unremarkable travelling case, Poirot discovered a slim ledger filled with a journalist's cramped, urgent shorthand, and a photograph, badly creased, of a shipping manifest dated 1942, bearing the stamp of a company Poirot recognized, from long acquaintance with such matters, as one that had transported considerably more than grapes across the demarcation line during the years of the occupation. "You will explain this, monsieur," Poirot said, when Fabre was brought before him, "or I shall be obliged to explain it to monsieur le commissaire myself, in terms considerably less generous than I might otherwise choose." Fabre's shoulders sagged, the last of his pretense collapsing all at once. Gustave d'Orival, Henri's father, used this estate's transport licenses during the war to move goods for men who were not merely selling wine, monsieur. "I have documents enough to suggest it, though not, I confess, quite enough to prove it beyond a courtroom's doubt. I came here hoping Henri might confirm or deny it in his own words, for a piece I intended to publish regardless. I did not come here to kill a man for his father's sins." "And yet you concealed this ledger with considerable care, and you have, by your own admission, spent 3 days hovering near a cellar door, behind which, I am given to understand, certain of Monsieur d'Orival's more sensitive papers are kept." "I hovered there, monsieur, because I hoped to find further proof, not because I intended murder." Fabre's voice cracked, with something that struck Poirot as genuine desperation rather than calculated performance. "Ask Louis Carnot if you do not believe me. He caught me near the cellar office twice, and threatened, the second time, to have me thrown from the estate bodily if I did not stop sniffing about where I was not wanted. I believed, at the time, he meant only to protect his master's papers. I wonder now whether he had rather more particular reasons to keep me away." Poirot regarded him for a long moment, weighing the ring of truth in the young man's voice against the very real possibility that a skilled liar might produce precisely that ring when required. "You will remain in this house, monsieur, until monsieur le commissaire releases you, and you will trouble yourself no further with cellar offices or hidden ledgers. I make no promise as to what use I shall make of what you have shown me. But I will say this: a man building a case against a family for the sins of its grandfather does not, as a rule, need also to poison the grandson. Unless the grandson's death serves some purpose, the sins alone do not." He left Fabre to his evident misery and returned, with Hastings trailing thoughtfully behind him, to the small study that had become, over the course of 2 long days, something very like his own private headquarters within the Chateau d'Orival. "A tangled business, Poirot," Hastings observed, dropping into a chair. "Old sins, new debts, a wife who may or may not have loved her husband, a son who wanted the vineyards run his own way, a daughter half mad with the need to be noticed, an American with money and no scruples about who he spends it on, a cellar master with 30 years of quiet fury, and now a journalist with a ledger full of wartime shame. I begin to think half of France had reason to want Henri d'Orival dead. You describe the surface most admirably, mon ami, and it is precisely the surface I wish now to set aside." Poirot seated himself at the desk, drawing toward him the small stack of notes he had accumulated over 2 days of interviews, and began, with the meticulous patience of a man assembling a mosaic from broken tile, to lay them out before him in a new and deliberate order. "Let us not ask any longer who might have wished Henri d'Orival dead, for I think we have established, quite thoroughly, that the answer is very nearly everyone in this house. Let us ask instead a narrower and, I think, considerably more useful question. Who, among these many people with motive, possessed also the particular knowledge required to select foxglove of all the world's poisons, and to judge with murderous precision the dose that would stop a man's heart within minutes, rather than merely making him ill?" "The book Vasseur mentioned," said Hastings slowly, "the one d'Orival asked her to find." The very book, mon ami, whose ashes I recovered from his study great on the night of his death. Burned, I am now quite certain, not by Henri d'Orival himself in idle curiosity satisfied, but by the very hand that had used its knowledge not 18 hours before, and who returned to that study, in the confusion following the death, to destroy the one piece of evidence that might point directly toward them. Chapter 10. The American's Offer. Poirot found Marcus Ryer in the library, ostensibly absorbed in a newspaper 3 days old, and drew a chair opposite him, with the unhurried air of a man who intended a longer conversation than the American might have preferred. "You spoke with Etienne d'Orival 2 nights before his father's death, monsieur, concerning terms under which the estate might be sold, were he ever in a position to sell it." Ryer set down his newspaper without visible alarm, though Poirot's practised eye caught the small stillness that preceded the response. "I did. I've told you as much already, and I'll tell the commissaire the same, in the same words, whenever he cares to ask. You will forgive me, monsieur, if I observe that a conversation of that particular character, conducted, I am given to understand, in some privacy, 2 nights before the man's death, might strike a suspicious mind as something considerably more than prudent business." "It would strike a suspicious mind as exactly that, Monsieur Poirot, which is why I didn't volunteer it Tuesday night in front of 30 grieving relatives and a commissaire eager for an easy answer. I'll give you the whole of it now, since you've plainly already got half." Ryer leaned forward, his easy manner giving way, for the first time since Poirot had met him, to something harder and more direct. "Etienne came to me, not the other way round. He'd grown tired of his father's refusals and wanted to know what terms I'd offer an heir, with full authority to sell, rather than a stubborn old man determined to die, owning every last vine of it. I told him what I'd told his father 3 times over, a generous figure, and a guarantee that Carnot would keep his position and his authority in the cellars, since a house this size needs a master who knows it. That's the whole of our conversation, and I'll swear to it on whatever book your commissaire prefers." "And did Monsieur Etienne indicate, in that conversation, any expectation of when such an inheritance might fall to him?" Rayer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He said his father wasn't a young man, and business, unlike sentiment, doesn't wait forever. I took it for the kind of thing men say about their fathers when they're frustrated and have had a glass too many, Monsieur Poirot, not for a declaration of murderous intent. If I'd thought otherwise, I promise you I'd have said something rather sooner than this." Poirot rose, thanking him with a courtesy that gave away nothing of his own conclusions, and made his way instead toward the terrace, where he had arranged, through Hastings, to meet Etienne d'Orival for a conversation the younger man had accepted with visible reluctance. "You did not think it worth mentioning," Poirot began, without preamble, once they stood together at the very balustrade where his father had died, "that you had already discussed, in private, the terms upon which this estate might be sold, before your father's death made such a discussion suddenly and conveniently relevant." Etienne's face had gone the colour of old ash. "I did not mention it because I knew precisely how it would look, and I was right, was I not? You look at me now as though I had already been tried and hanged." "I look at you, monsieur, as a man attempting to weigh a great deal of circumstance against a very small quantity of proof, and finding the circumstance, I confess, considerably heavier than I would wish." Poirot's voice remained mild, but his eyes did not leave Etienne's face. "You had motive in your father's continued refusal to modernize the estate as you wished. You had motive in a private conversation with a buyer, conducted behind your father's back, 2 nights before his death. You had opportunity, as his son, to stand near him at any moment of that toast, without a single soul remarking it as unusual. What you have not yet given me, monsieur, is any account of where you stood, and what you did, in the 90 seconds between the pouring of your father's glass and the moment he raised it to his lips. Etienne was silent for a long moment, his hands gripping the stone balustrade until the knuckles whitened, and when at last he spoke, his voice had lost all of its earlier belligerence and carried, instead, something that sounded very much like fear. I stood beside my sister, Monsieur Poirot. I stood beside Camille the entire time, because she had asked me, not 5 minutes before the toast began, to stay close to her. She said she could not face our father's speech alone. I thought it a small kindness to grant a sister who so rarely asked me for anything at all. I did not think, until this very moment, standing here with you, to wonder why, of all the toasts our family has ever drunk together, that was the one at which she suddenly could not bear to stand alone. Chapter 11. A photograph in the wine cellar. Poirot's return to the cellars that afternoon was not, this time, in search of Louis Carnot, but of the small office adjoining the aging rooms where the chef de cave kept his ledgers, his tasting notes, and, Poirot suspected, given the man's evident territoriality regarding the space, a good deal more besides. He found the office locked, but a word to Madame Brassard and a further word to Berthold produced within the hour both a key and the commissaire's grudging authorization, and Poirot let himself in as the last of the afternoon light slanted through a small high window, dust motes turning gold in its narrow beam. The office was as orderly as its occupant's craft demanded. Ledgers stacked with meticulous precision, tasting notes filed by vintage and by cask, a single worn armchair beside a small stove, long since gone cold. It was in the drawer of a small writing desk, beneath a stack of correspondence concerning nothing more sinister than cork suppliers, that Poirot's searching fingers found a photograph, old and much handled, its edges soft with years of being taken out and looked at and put away again. It showed a young woman, perhaps 20, standing before the very cellars in which Poirot now stood, her arm linked through that of a young man Poirot recognized, despite the years between the photograph and the present, as a considerably younger Louis Carnot, and beside them both, smiling with the particular warmth of a young man not yet burdened by the estate he would one day inherit, stood Henri Doreval himself. On the reverse, in a hand Poirot now recognized from Doreval's own study correspondence, was written a single line: Marguerite, Louis, and myself. The summer before everything changed. 1919. It was Odile Vasseur summoned once more to the small study and shown the photograph without preamble, who supplied the final piece Poirot had been circling for 2 days without quite grasping its shape. Marguerite Carnot, she said slowly, turning the photograph in her hands with an expression of dawning and unhappy comprehension. Louis's sister. I had forgotten her name until this moment, monsieur, though I remember the story well enough. It was old history, even when I first came to this house. She and Henri were sweethearts. Before the war, before Henri's father arranged his marriage instead to a woman of greater fortune and better family. Marguerite died some years later, in childbirth, I believe, married by then to another man entirely. I had not thought of it in a decade. And the child, madame, did it survive her? Odile's brow furrowed. I believe it did, though I could not tell you what became of it. Louis never spoke of his sister, not once in all my years in this house, and I learned long ago not to ask. Poirot sat for a long moment with the photograph before him, turning over in his mind a possibility that had not, until this instant, occurred to him at all. A thread quite separate from grievances over cellar walls and collapsing racks, quite separate from wartime shipping manifests and ambitious sons, a thread reaching back 30 years to a summer photograph and a sister whose name had been, until a moment ago, entirely forgotten by everyone in this house, save, perhaps, the one man who could not afford to let anyone remember it. Hastings, he said, when his old friend appeared in answer to his summons, I wish you to discover for me with all the discretion you can muster, whether Marguerite Carnot's child, assuming it lived, might by any chance still be residing beneath this very roof, under a name none of us has yet thought to question. Hastings's eyebrows rose. You think one of the family? I think, mon ami, that I have been asking these people what they hope to gain from Henri d'Orival's will, when I ought perhaps to have been asking them what they hope to gain from Henri d'Orival's blood. Chapter 12. The Secretary's Silence. Hastings's inquiries, conducted with a discretion that Poirot privately judged considerably less subtle than his friend believed it to be, produced by the following morning a piece of information that struck the investigation like a stone through glass. Camille d'Orival had been born, according to the parish register Hastings had persuaded the local curé to produce, not to Henri's first wife at all, but 11 months after that wife's death, and Henri's second marriage, to the woman universally believed to be Camille's mother, had not taken place until some 4 months after Camille's birth. It does not of itself prove anything sinister, Poirot said, studying the register's careful copperplate entries with the particular intensity he reserved for facts that threatened to rearrange everything he had previously believed. Many a marriage follows rather than precedes a birth, and the world thinks none the worse of it, provided the dates are managed with sufficient discretion. But it raises a question I had not thought to ask. Was Camille truly the daughter of the woman she called mother? Or was she— He did not finish the thought aloud, but summoned Odile Vasseur once more, and this time asked her the question directly, without preamble or courtesy. You have served this family 15 years, madame, and you knew Henri d'Orival, by your own admission, better than any confessor knows a soul. Tell me plainly, is Camille d'Orival the daughter of Marguerite Carnot? Odile's composure, so carefully maintained through 2 days of questioning, broke at last, and she sank into the chair opposite Poirot's desk, as though her legs would no longer support the weight of the answer she was about to give. I have known it for 12 years, Monsieur Poirot, and I have told no living soul, because Henri asked me, on the day he told me himself, never to speak of it while he lived. Marguerite died bearing his child, not her husband's, a fact her husband never suspected or chose never to acknowledge, and raised the girl as his own until his own death, when Camille was 6, left Henri free to take the child into his household as a ward of uncertain parentage, and later, when his own marriage produced no daughter of its own, to present her to the world as a child of that marriage instead, adopted quietly and never questioned, because who, in a house so grand, would think to question the master's own account of his family? Does Camille herself know? She learned it 8 years ago, monsieur, quite by accident, a letter she was not meant to find among her father's private papers. She came to me in tears, and I confirmed what the letter had already told her, because I could not, in conscience, add a lie to a truth she had already half discovered. Odile's hands twisted in her lap. She begged me never to tell Henri that she knew. I believe she could not bear for him to know that she now understood the full shape of her own history, a child of scandal, presented to a house as a daughter of privilege, and never once in all her life told the truth by the one man who owed it to her. And does Louis Carnot know? Odile's silence this time was answer enough. He is her uncle, madame, Marguerite's brother, Camille's blood. I believe he has known for some years, monsieur, though I could not tell you how he learned it, nor when. I have seen them together, once or twice, in the lower garden, speaking with an intimacy I did not, at the time, understand. I understand it now. Poirot rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the terrace where Henri d'Orival had died, and where, he now understood, the roots of that death reached back not merely to a will unrevised or an estate unsold, but to a summer 30 years gone, a sister buried in another man's grave, and a daughter who had spent her entire life being loved conditionally by a father who had never once told her the truth of who she was. "I think, madame," he said quietly, "that it is time I spoke with Camille Doraval and her uncle together, before this house loses, through fear and silence, whatever chance remains of learning the whole truth rather than merely the comfortable half of it." Chapter 13. Cracks in the Cuvée. Camille Doraval and Louis Carnot, brought together in the small study at Poirot's insistence, presented at first the appearance of two strangers meeting by chance rather than two people bound by blood and by a shared and terrible secret. It was Poirot who broke the pretense, laying the old photograph upon the desk between them, with the deliberate care of a man placing the final piece into a puzzle he has, at last, fully understood. "I know," he said simply, "that Marguerite Carnot was your mother, madame, and your sister, monsieur. I know that Henri Doraval kept this truth from the world for 30 years, and from you, madame, for the whole of your life, until a letter revealed it 8 years ago. I know that you have known this secret together, in silence, for some years now, and I believe, though I invite you to correct me if I am wrong, that this shared silence has grown, in recent months, into something considerably heavier than either of you anticipated when you first agreed to bear it." Camille's face had gone white, but it was Carnot who spoke first, his voice low and rough with an emotion he had kept banked, Poirot suspected, for a very long time indeed. "She came to me 4 years ago, monsieur, when she learned the truth, came to the one person left alive who had known her mother, because she could not bring herself to ask her father the questions she needed answered. I told her what I knew. I told her that Henri had loved Marguerite once. Truly, before his own father arranged a marriage, he had not the courage to refuse. I told her that Henri's silence toward her, all her life, was not indifference but cowardice. A man too ashamed of his own weakness to ever look his daughter in the eye and admit what he had cost her mother. And this knowledge," Poirot said gently, "did it draw you together, monsieur, in sympathy, or did it draw you together, perhaps, in a shared and growing anger toward the man who had wronged you both?" Carnot's hands, resting on the desk, curled slowly into fists. "I will not deny that I hated him, monsieur, for my father's death in these cellars, and I will not deny that I came to hate him a second time for what his cowardice had done to my sister's memory and to her daughter's whole life. But hatred nursed for 30 years does not, of itself, become murder in the space of a single afternoon. I did not kill Henri Doraval." "Nor did I," said Camille, and her voice, though barely above a whisper, carried a conviction that struck Poirot as entirely genuine. "I confess I asked Etienne to stand beside me during the toast because I could not bear to watch our father, my father, raise his glass to 100 years of a family history that had never once made room for the truth of my own beginning. I stood beside him during those 90 seconds you have asked so much about, Monsieur Poirot, and I touched his sleeve, and I said nothing more than 'Félicitations, papa,' words I had said to him 100 times before, and which meant, on that occasion, considerably less than they had ever meant, because I had already decided in my own heart that after this weekend I would tell him I knew the truth, and ask him, at last, to say it to my face." Poirot studied her for a long moment, weighing the tremor in her voice against the plain, unrehearsed grief that ran beneath it, and found himself inclined, against all the caution of long professional habit, to believe her. "You touched his sleeve, madame. Tell me precisely, with which hand and upon which side did you stand?" "His left side, monsieur, and I touched his left sleeve, near the wrist. I recall it exactly, because my brother stood at my other side, and I felt, for that one moment, less alone than I had felt in years." Poirot's eyes moved, very slowly, to Louis Carnot's own hands, resting still upon the desk, and to the small, unremarkable scar, old and white, across the knuckle of his right forefinger, which Poirot had noticed once before, in the cellars, without at the time understanding its significance. "And you, monsieur," he said quietly, "on which side of Henri d'Orival did you stand when you poured his glass and stepped back to watch the toast with the rest of the household?" Chapter 14. The Weight of an Old Debt. Louis Carnot did not answer at once, and in the silence that stretched between Poirot's question and whatever answer might follow it, Poirot watched the man's weathered face pass through something very like the collapse of a wall, long straining against a pressure it could no longer bear. "I stood at his right hand, monsieur, as I have stood at his right hand for 30 years of ceremonial toasts, because it is the chef de cave's place to stand where he may retrieve an empty glass with the least disturbance to the guests." Carnot's voice had gone very quiet. I poured his glass from the magnum. I stepped back to my position. I watched the toast, as I have watched 30 years of them, with the studied blankness a servant learns to wear whether his heart is glad or breaking. "That is the whole of what I did, Monsieur Poirot, and I will swear to it before any court in France." "And yet," said Poirot, very gently, "you burned a book of toxicology from Henri d'Orival's own study, on the very afternoon of his death, before the gendarmes had even completed their first survey of the house." The silence that followed this was of an entirely different character than any that had preceded it in that room, absolute and freighted with an admission not yet spoken but no longer, Poirot thought, deniable. "I did not poison him," Carnot said at last, and something in the flat, exhausted finality of the words carried, for the first time in 2 days of interviews, the unmistakable ring of complete truth. "But I found the book, monsieur, in his study, on the afternoon of the reception, hours before the toast. I had gone to ask him a question about the evening's arrangements, and found him not there, but the book lying open upon his desk, a page marked with a slip of paper, at the very passage concerning foxglove and its action upon a failing heart. I did not understand, at the time, why Henri d'Orival should be reading such a thing at all, on the very day of his own centenary." "You believed," said Poirot slowly, "that he intended to poison someone else." Carnot's eyes, when they rose to meet Poirot's, were wet with an old grief finally given voice. "I believed, monsieur, God forgive me, that he intended it for himself. He had spoken to me, some weeks before, in a low and troubled moment I had thought at the time merely the fatigue of an old man facing a difficult anniversary, of debts he could not pay, of a sail to Rhea he had refused 3 times but knew, in his heart, he could refuse no longer without ruining half the families whose livelihoods depended on this estate. I believed, and I burned that book, monsieur, because I believed it, that Henri d'Orival intended to take his own life quietly, after the centenary, rather than preside over his family's ruin, and I could not bear for the world to learn that the last master of Champagne d'Orival had died a suicide, rather than the natural death his age and his heart would have made so easy to believe. I burned the book to protect what remained of his name, monsieur, not to hide my own crime. I did not kill him. I tried in my own foolish and too late fashion to save him from himself, and I failed at that, as I failed at everything else in this wretched house." Poirot sat in silence for a long moment, and Camille, beside her uncle, had begun to weep, not, Poirot thought, for the confession itself, but for the terrible and belated understanding of a father's private despair that neither she nor anyone else in that house had been permitted to see. "You have told me a great deal, monsieur," Poirot said at last, rising slowly from his chair, "and I believe every word of it. But you have not, I think, told me the whole truth of why a man contemplating his own quiet end would arrange of all things to poison a single glass poured for himself alone before an audience of 30 witnesses, when a private dose, taken quietly in his own study after the guests had gone, would have served his purpose so very much better and spared his family the scandal you tried so hard to prevent." He turned toward the window and the last light of the day, and let the question hang in the air between them. No, monsieur. I do not think Henri d'Orival poisoned himself at all. I think someone in this house discovered, exactly as you did, precisely what he had been reading, and understood, exactly as you did not, how very useful a man's own private despair might be, as a shield behind which an entirely different murder could be very comfortably hidden. Chapter 15. Poirot sets the table. That evening, at Poirot's request, the household gathered once more in the great salon, not, this time, in the disordered grief of the night of the death, but in the wary, watchful silence of people who understood that something was about to be concluded, and who each, in their own private fashion, feared what that conclusion might contain. Commissaire Berthold stood near the door, his men discreetly posted beyond it. Etienne sat rigid beside Sylvie, who had abandoned, at last, the theatrical grief of the first evening for something quieter and more genuine. Camille sat beside Louis Carnot, no longer troubling to disguise the kinship that bound them, her hand resting on her uncle's arm. Marcus Ryer stood near the cold hearth, with the composed patience of a man who had weathered a great many uncomfortable negotiations and expected to weather this one too. Julien Fabre sat apart, notebook closed upon his knee, watching Poirot with the fixed attention of a man who suspected he was about to witness the very story he had come here hoping to find. Odile Vasseur stood near the door, as she had stood on the first evening, belonging fully to neither family nor staff. "I have spent 2 days," Poirot began, when the room had settled into the particular silence that precedes a reckoning, "listening to this household explain to me, with great thoroughness, every reason each of you might have wished Henri d'Orival dead." Monsieur Etienne resented his father's refusal to modernize the estate, and had spoken, behind that father's back, with a buyer eager to acquire it. Madame Camille had spent a lifetime aching for a recognition her father, out of cowardice rather than cruelty, had never given her. Madame Sylvie stood to lose, under a revised will, whatever new provision her husband intended for his children. Monsieur Ryer wished very much to own this estate, and had found, in Etienne, an heir more willing to sell it than the father had ever been. Monsieur Fabre carried in his luggage evidence of a wartime shame that Henri d'Orival's death would neither confirm nor bury, but which his continued life might well have forced, at last, into the light. And Monsieur Carnot carried a grief 30 years old, for a father dead in these very cellars, and a second grief more recent still, for a sister whose memory Henri d'Orival's cowardice had denied its rightful place in this family's history. He paused, letting the weight of this recitation settle over the room. "Every one of you, I have found, possessed motive enough to satisfy a court of law, and every one of you, I confess, very nearly succeeded in persuading me that your motive, however real, had not in fact been acted upon. It was Monsieur Carnot's confession, offered, I believe, in genuine grief rather than genuine guilt, that at last showed me the shape of the true crime. He discovered, on the afternoon of the reception, that Henri d'Orival had been reading a foxglove and its action upon a failing heart, and concluded, from love and long loyalty, that his master intended to take his own life. He burned the evidence to protect a dying man's name. He did not consider, nor, I confess, did I, until a few hours ago, that someone else in this house might have discovered that same reading, drawn an entirely different and more useful conclusion from it, and understood that a household already primed to whisper of Henri d'Orival's private despair would look no further, once he was dead, than a broken heart and a quiet act of self-destruction, provided, of course, that the death occurred quietly and not before 30 witnesses at a centenary toast. Sylvie d'Orival had begun, very quietly, to weep. Not the composed and careful dabbing of the first evening, but something rawer, less mindful of its own appearance. I told myself these 2 days that it did not matter who among us had done it, so long as it was not one of the children. I see now how selfish a wish that was, Monsieur Poirot, and how little it has spared any of us. Grief rarely consults our preferences, madame, as to whom it may most conveniently be permitted to touch. Poirot's voice remained gentle, though his eyes had not left the small, still figure by the door. But you are right that it matters a great deal who among you carried this thing to its conclusion, for the law, unlike grief, insists upon precision. Then why, said Etienne, his voice tight, did it happen exactly there, before all of us, in the worst possible circumstances for concealment? Because, monsieur, said Poirot, and his eyes, moving slowly around the room, came at last to rest upon a single face that had, throughout the whole of his recitation, remained very still, very composed, and very carefully attentive. Our murderer did not choose the moment of the toast at all. Our murderer chose, rather, to act at the one moment in this entire weekend when they could be certain, beyond any possibility of contradiction, that a large and specific dose could be delivered directly into Henri d'Orival's glass, unwitnessed by 30 pairs of eyes fixed everywhere but upon that glass, and could rely, absolutely, upon Monsieur Carnot's very love and loyalty to erase, within hours, the one piece of physical evidence that might otherwise have pointed toward a very different and far more calculating hand. Chapter 16. The Reveal at the Long Table. You will recall, Poirot continued, moving now to stand before the cold hearth, so that every face in the room was turned toward him, that I asked, quite early in this investigation, who stood close enough to Henri d'Orival's glass, in the 90 seconds between its pouring and his drinking, to introduce a substance into it unremarked. Madame Camille touched his left sleeve and spoke 2 words of ordinary affection. Monsieur Carnot poured the glass, and withdrew to his customary position at d'Orival's right hand, from which he could retrieve an empty glass with minimum disturbance, a position, I would observe, that placed him nearest the glass of anyone in this gathering, yet a position so entirely customary, so utterly expected, that not one of 30 witnesses thought to remark upon it as anything other than the ordinary business of a servant performing his duty. He let this observation hang in the air for a moment before continuing. And it was this very ordinariness, I believe, that our murderer relied upon most heavily, not merely the 90 seconds of opportunity, but the certainty that a servant standing at his customary post would draw no eye whatsoever, while a family member standing at that same post would draw every eye in the room, which meant that our murderer required, above all else, an excuse to occupy Louis Carnot's own position at that fatal moment, or, failing that, to approach the glass in some manner so thoroughly sanctioned by custom that no one, then or since, would think to question it. Poirot's gaze moved, at last, to Odile Vasseur, who stood very still near the door, her composure, for the first time in 2 days, beginning visibly to fracture. Madame Vasseur approached Henri d'Orival during that same interval, by Madame Brassard's own careful recollection, bearing a small card of the day's arrangements, a gesture so entirely within her customary duties, as his secretary of 15 years, that not a single witness thought it worth remarking upon, then or since. It was, I confess, the very last thread I permitted myself to follow, because it seemed to me, for a considerable time, the least likely of all. A woman who had served this family with apparent loyalty for 15 years, who wept, quite convincingly, upon learning of Camille's true parentage, and who came to me herself, unprompted, with the detail of the toxicology book, in what I took, at the time, for an act of conscience rather than calculation. "You cannot mean," Etienne began, but Poirot raised a hand, and the room fell silent once more. "I asked myself, Madame Vasseur, why a woman who wished to conceal her own guilt would volunteer, of her own accord, the very detail most likely to point an investigator toward the truth. And I concluded, at last, that you did so precisely because you believed it would point me, instead toward Henri d'Orival's own hand upon his own death, that the book and its ashes would suggest a man contemplating suicide rather than a woman contemplating murder, exactly as it very nearly suggested to Monsieur Carnot himself. You gambled, madame, that grief and shame would close this case as a private tragedy rather than a public scandal, and you very nearly won that gamble. Odile Vasseur's face had gone the colour of old paper, but her voice, when it came, was steady with the particular calm of someone who has, at last, stopped running. You have no proof, Monsieur Poirot. A card delivered, a book located at a request I did not question at the time. These are not the makings of a murder charge. No, madame, they are not, of themselves. But I did not spend these 2 days idle in my other inquiries. I know now that you managed Henri d'Orival's private accounts for 15 years, and that those accounts, examined this very afternoon by Monsieur le Commissaire's own auditor at my request, show a discrepancy of some considerable size, accumulated slowly across a decade, and due to be discovered, indeed, was to be discovered, this very weekend, as part of the very will revision Monsieur d'Orival intended to complete. He had asked you 3 weeks ago to prepare the final accounts for his lawyer's inspection. It was that request, I believe, madame, and not any wrong done 30 years past, that gave you 90 seconds and a very great deal of reason to make certain Henri d'Orival never lived to read what those accounts would show. Chapter 17. The Last Glass. The silence that followed lasted longer than any that had preceded it in that long and difficult day, and it was broken, at last, not by denial, but by something very like relief, the particular, terrible relief of a burden finally set down after being carried too long and too far to be carried any further. 15 years, Odile Vasseur said quietly, and her voice, stripped now of its careful composure, had aged a decade in the space of a single sentence. 15 years of managing this man's fortune while my own, entrusted to a nephew I trusted rather more than I ought, was quietly destroyed by his poor investments and my own foolish silence about it. I began, 4 years ago, to borrow. Only borrow, Monsieur Poirot, I told myself at the time, against accounts so large that Henri d'Orival would never miss so small a sum, and which I fully intended to repay before anyone thought to look closely. But small sums become larger sums, and 1 year's borrowing becomes the next year's necessity, and by the time Henri told me, 3 weeks ago, that his lawyer would require the full accounts for his revised will, I understood that 15 years of careful, loyal service was about to end not in the modest pension I had earned, but in a prosecution that would leave me destitute and disgraced in the few years I have left to me. "And so you found the book," said Poirot gently, "when Henri asked you to locate it, and you read, in its pages, precisely how a woman with 15 years of intimate knowledge of this household's customs might arrange, before 30 witnesses and behind the perfect cover of her own ordinary duties, to ensure that Henri d'Orival never lived to see those accounts examined at all. I did not want to kill him." Her voice broke, at last, into something that was almost a sob. "I had known him 15 years. I had wept for him, this past 2 days, and the weeping was not entirely false, monsieur, whatever else you believe of me. But I am 61 years old, and the thought of prison, of disgrace, of ending my life as the woman who had stolen from a man who had trusted her absolutely, I could not bear it. I could not." "And so," said Poirot quietly, "you carried a small vial concealed within the card you brought to him, and in the moment of delivering it, with a gesture so ordinary that 30 witnesses looked everywhere but at your hands, you emptied it into a glass already poured and waiting, and then you withdrew, as you had withdrawn 1,000 times before with 1,000 ordinary notes and cards, and watched a man you had served for 15 years die before you, secure in the knowledge that a grieving household, primed by circumstance to suspect a private despair, would look everywhere except toward the one person whose duties had made her, for 15 years, entirely and comfortably invisible. Commissaire Berthold stepped forward at last, and the formalities that followed, the quiet words of arrest, the gendarmes at the door, Odile Vasseur's departure from the great salon, with a dignity that struck even Poirot as oddly moving, given all that had preceded it, passed in the particular hush that follows the end of a long and terrible thing. It was much later that evening, the household finally emptied of gendarmes and reporters and the last of the departing guests, that Poirot stood once more upon the terrace with Hastings, a fresh bottle of the Cuvée du Centenaire, opened, this time by Louis Carnot's own steady hand, and tasted first, at Poirot's quiet insistence, by Carnot himself before any other lips touched it, between them. "A sad business, Poirot," said Hastings, watching the last light fade over the vines. "A woman driven to murder, not by love or hatred or old grievance, but by simple fear of disgrace, and a household nearly torn apart in the search for something far more dramatic than the truth turned out to be. It is always so, mon ami, more often than the newspapers would have us believe." Poirot turned his glass slowly by its stem, watching the wine catch the last of the light exactly as it had caught it 2 evenings before. In a moment, none of them could now unremember. We look always for the grand motive, the old grievance, the wartime shame, the bitter inheritance, and we forget how often it is fear, simple and unglamorous, that drives a hand to do what love and hatred together could not. Madame Vasseur did not hate Henri d'Orival. She feared, very simply, what his continued life would cost her. And fear, Hastings, is a poison quite as effective as any that grows in a hedgerow, and very much harder, I think, to guard against. He raised his glass, in the gathering dark, to the vines and the chalk hills beyond them, and to 100 years of patience that had, in the end, outlasted every one of the small and human frailties that had gathered, however briefly, to trouble it. "To Henri d'Orival," he said quietly, "who deserved, I think, a rather better end than the one his own household gave him, and to the truth, mon ami, which is so very often less dramatic, and so very much sadder than the mystery that surrounds it." Hastings drank in silence for a while, watching the last colour drain from the sky above the vines. "What becomes of them now, do you suppose, Camille and Carnot and the rest?" "Camille d'Orival will inherit, I imagine, a great deal more than a name she once believed was not truly hers, and I think she will find, in time, that the truth of her birth weighs rather less upon her than the years of silence that preceded its discovery. Carnot, I suspect, will remain in these cellars until he is too old to lift a bottle, and will die, when his own time comes, a good deal more at peace than his poor father ever was permitted to be. Etienne will very likely sell some portion of the estate to Monsieur Reyer, and will discover, I think, that a man may modernize a vineyard without dishonouring the memory of the father who once refused him the chance. And Sylvie will mourn a husband she loved rather more genuinely than this household ever gave her credit for, and will, I hope, be allowed at last to do so without an audience weighing the sincerity of her tears. And Fabre? Will he publish his story of the wartime shipments? I imagine he will, mon ami, for a journalist's conscience is a stubborn thing, and I do not know that Henri d'Orival's death has made his father's sins any less deserving of daylight. But I think he will write it now with rather more compassion than he arrived here possessing, for he has watched, these 2 days, precisely what the weight of an old family's secrets can do to those who inherit them unknowing. Poirot set down his glass at last and looked out, for a long moment, over the darkening rows of vines that would, in 100 years' time, still be tended by hands not yet born, indifferent to the small and terrible dramas of the particular family that happened, for 1 century, to call them their own. "Come, Hastings. It has been a long 2 days, and I find that even a detective's little grey cells require, on occasion, nothing more than a good dinner and an early bed. Tomorrow we return to London, and to whatever smaller mysteries await us there, though I confess I shall drink no champagne, for some months at least, without a small and private toast to Henri d'Orival, and to the very great difference between the man his household believed him to be, and the far more human, far more forgivable man he actually was. The end.